I thought it'd be good to, this is pretty topical because obviously the last few days, it's been a rough ride really for some of the leading AI stocks. There is a discussion, obviously, within the investment community about the fact that the um, AI stocks or AI related stocks are going parabolic. The valuations are astonishing. We now have well, I think it's dipped a little bit over recent days, but about 22 trillion of market capitalization for the Magnificent Seven stocks. But what do you think is the agenda behind AI? Is it that they want to simply stop us thinking and provide us with all the answers, shrink wrapped with a digital
No,
ribbon?
I think it's a little bit more insidious than that. I think that these data centers will ultimately end up being state-owned surveillance centers when the amounts of debt that have been raised to invest in these centers, when it becomes clear that there's no return on that money. There's a bit of a misunderstanding of the whole epistemology of AI at the heart of all of this. There's this idea that there's a race on, and
Mm.
that AI is going to improve in the same way that Moore's law unfolded for processing speeds. But there's no reason to expect this to be the case. As you deal with greater levels of complexity, the energetic demands of resolving that complexity escalate at a very rapid rate. And I think what's being done here is that they're just throwing more energy, more hardware at the problem, expecting that these models are going to produce superior performance as they do that. But as I said, the energetic requirements for resolving complexity escalate extremely rapidly. And so I think there will be very modest returns to this kind of scale play. And this whole idea, it's closely related to this whole idea of an AI singularity. One day we're going to just open our computers and see that the AI has developed general intelligence, and has become more intelligent than human beings. And at that place, at that point, it's held to represent a sort of escape velocity, where it rapidly starts being able to plot against humanity and do things for its own good as opposed to humanity's good, and so on. It's kind of a ghost story. But we don't know how to program creative problem solving, which is at the heart of general intelligence. And until we know how to write down those algorithms for creativity, I don't see any scope for any of these models to spontaneously become general intelligence, artificial general intelligence.
Yeah.
So this whole
Despite
sort of
despite
singularity
the fact,
story is
yeah,
nonsense.
because Musk is quite fond of saying, isn't he, that the percentage likelihood of reaching general intelligence is such and such. But
Yeah.
but then he caveats and says, "Oh no, I don't think we'll achieve that until year X."
Yeah,
X.
exactly. It's always in the future. And I think the probability of reaching that, given the current state of our theories of knowledge, is 0%. There will be no spontaneous AGI coming about. I think we can rule that one out.
Yeah, and obviously with digital technology, it would be singularly impossible. Um, the um, the other issue really is in terms of the bubble, that it's clear that they can't, OpenAI, for example, hasn't really been able to monetize its models effectively. The run rate is in terms of revenue growth is significant, but it's largely coming from the commercial sector, mostly from companies that want to be seen to be in the AI space. But there's no way really that OpenAI at its current run rate is going to be profitable to the the level that would be required to repay this huge capital investment. And of course, Sam Altman has said that he ultimately is going to have to require some federal bailout. Is this all part of the war narrative, namely that the US government is going to have to get actively involved to win this particular AI war? We're going to hear more of this, do you think, as putting your investor hat on?
I think it was always the end game. I mean, as I said, I think these data centers become state-owned properties that are then used as surveillance centers to surveil civilian populations. And yeah, I don't see it as the private model, of selling tokens as being a winning proposition at all. So these businesses, Altman's right, he's going to need a bailout, but it's not going to be a bailout so much as a kind of a public ownership move. And I think that's going to be true for a great deal of infrastructure around the world. If you look at how these debt indentures are structured and the terms and conditions around them, I think many a national asset will ultimately end up in an international trust somewhere, no longer owned by the sovereign state. And I would just include data centers alongside other types of energy infrastructure and natural resources that are prone to finding themselves ending up in these sort of extraterritorial trusts run by your friendly local globalist.
Does that imply that the AI bubbling is part of a wider initiative or impetus towards one world government? You know, that the US is kind of going to appoint itself as that entity of one world government, and of course, as nation states teeter in terms of their own debt bubbles. That we'll perhaps see the AI narrative as an exemplar for how global government will be achieved?
Yeah, I think it's part of a cluster of notions and trajectories that drive in the direction of the surveillance state. We've seen how enthusiastic the Trump administration has been in supporting Palantir, and how Palantir has been involved in marketing digital identities in such far-flung places as Switzerland, where they sponsored the Yes campaign. These are not benign companies. They're not there for our protection and our safety as they would claim to be. These are companies that will invade privacy, will surveil, will ultimately be used to smother dissent and to invoke censorship. We should be under no illusions that they are benign at all.
Yeah, is the current structural faults within MAGA imply that there is a repositioning going on at the top of the MAGA project, such that the technocrats are going to increasingly flex their muscles? Do you feel that JD Vance is going to be positioned to be,
Yep.
Head of this movement going forward? He and obviously Taylor joined at the hip, but is that the agenda, do you think?
Yes, I think that's where we end up. I mean, and it's relevant to consider Trump's age relative to Vance's. Vance is very much a creature of Peter Thiel, who obviously is a founder of Palantir and an investor. And I think he, is there to deliver the surveillance state assets, within the sort of uni-party structure. So I am a uni-party theorist. I don't believe that democracies offer a palette of candidates that reflects the will of the people. We see the will of elites being expressed in terms of the candidates we are allowed to vote upon, and I think you've got the whole thing teed up with Vance being there to sort of put the gloss on the conservative play, if you like, whereas what is actually being rolled out is no different from what you would have got under Kamala Harris, a globalist, New World Order type implementation of the surveillance state at a supranational level, at a level that's very hard to attack in any kind of legal sense.
No, it's clear that these technocratic structures, in order to maintain the momentum, towards digital ID and statewide surveillance, et cetera, this requires an awful lot of money and an awful lot of spending by governments on those technology companies that obviously have been riding the crest of the wave, really, in terms of their growth profiles. Companies like Palantir. And that requires a huge amount of debt. So therefore, this intimately involves obviously the treasuries and the central banks, and in terms of sort of sustaining this idea. However, do you think there's a fragility built into it, in that we may see sovereign defaults? U.S. debt is now about 38 trillion. And of course, this, it's and vastly greater, obviously, in terms of some of the other stuff. But do you think it will collapse under its own weight? So is it a bit like the War of the Worlds, where perhaps something as simple as the fact that they can't get their guilt away is going to be the cause of the fractures?
Yeah, look, I mean, collapse is the inevitable endpoint of any centralization play. And what we're seeing in the form of this kind of New World Order globalist trajectory is a very bad case of centralization. Centralization, in order to be maintained, has to stifle dissent. And it can accept no challenges to the hierarchy that centralization sets up. So what that means is you disable the whole project of conjecture and criticism, which is the only known way to generate new knowledge and therefore economic growth on a per capita basis. So if you're progressively centralizing everything, cutting off the actual epistemological basis for knowledge growth and economic growth, you're describing a system whose collapse is inevitable. At some point, some element of fragility kicks in. The absence of the normal mechanisms of error correction that take place in decentralized systems brings the whole story crashing down. And you have suddenly a collapsing center and a power vacuum at that center. I think this is the inevitable trajectory of the globalists. They believe that they've solved old economic problems, such as the information problem, or the data problem, or the coordination problem, but they have not. Having access to more and more data doesn't solve those problems. They are fundamental problems that do not depend on how much data you have access to and how fancy your systems of control are. So yeah, I see it as heading for collapse. There will be sovereign events, and I think those will be used to kind of shoehorn a globalist kind of dispensation into place. Look at how badly national governments have been doing. We need sensible people in Basel and Geneva and the city of London and New York to make these decisions where these hapless politicians have been so poor.
Yeah, and it's you mentioned in the James Delingpole interview that the likely trajectory of this collapse, and that it could be, for example, mandating, ridiculous strictures on small businesses, but mostly the corporates have been forging ahead with some of the more ridiculous aspects of globalism. But the more and more that is enforced right down the food chain, the more likely it is that the entire edifice will collapse in on itself. Do you think, though, that the collapse will come from the direction of collapsing fiat money, for example, or is it more that it'll be a structural collapse that literally people will not be able to? It's going to be like an Atlas Shrugged type situation where all of the wealth creators go on strike. What's your gut instinct tell you in terms of where the collapse will emanate from?
I think there's a big demographic overhang. What's happened is that the boomers have accumulated. This is now talking in very broad terms about the West in general. The boomers have accrued various benefits that commitments have been made to them regarding how long they're going to be able to spend in retirement and how much healthcare access they will have, how much retirement income they will have. And the burden of those benefits can only fall on the economically active population. And it's really quite extreme. If you consider that from the age of birth to, say, 24, 25, people in the West are typically not economically active, and then they'll be active from the age of 25 to 65, and then for a period of some 25 years after that, not economically active again. So the demand is that people should be able to spend 50 years out of their designated 85 or whatever, not being economically active and living off the fruits of others' labors. And that ultimately describes a system of slavery. The only way you can get young people to support those immense levels of benefits is by effectively enslaving them, by forcing them into to work and under conditions of regressive financial stricture. And I think that ultimately that's where there will be a kind of a strike. The students saddled with high levels of education debt, and people entering the workplace and finding that they're unable to support themselves in any kind of semblance of a life. And we already saw a little bit of it when the lockdowns came to an end and people went back to face-to-face existence after furlough and Zoom meetings and so on. Many people just didn't return to their old bricks and mortar jobs. So, for example, if you go and visit Belgium, there's a chronic shortage of people in the hospitality industry because the people who were furloughed simply never went back to their old positions. They moved out into provincial towns, got a side hustle going, reduced their costs by not living inside one of the major city centers. And so the entire industry of restaurants and hospitality in Belgium took this knock, and the service levels plummeted, and it's become a perfectly horrible place to visit in Brussels as a result of all of this. And so I think these types of effect are closer than people imagine, and yes, it is sensible to conceive of them as being a kind of strike. It's always the case that your SMEs are the engines for growth in economies. And what's been happening over the last 5 years is that we've seen large corporations lobbying hard to produce an uneven playing field that makes it very difficult for the small and medium enterprise. So all of these ESG, DEI, stakeholder capitalism, boondoggles are kind of, they have a fixed cost component which favors the large corporation and imposes unsustainable costs on SMEs. And so you've got this kind of situation where SMEs are embattled. It's quite difficult for them to navigate all the layers of bureaucracy put between them and getting the job of turning an economic profit done. Yeah, I think the system is creaking. You've seen the complete evisceration of the Mittelstand in Germany with this trajectory towards nearshoring, as they call it, where they basically export the industry to Turkey or to wherever, some Poland or to some other neighboring country, because they can no longer afford to pay the rising costs of energy and compliance. And so this is how it all starts. I think you see the beginning of the end in such developments.
Yeah, and the point you make about, the ESG requirements being pushed into SMEs, a lot of people, even regardless of the financial impact of that, just ethically, it would repulse so many small business people so much that it would probably force them out of running businesses, or it would create a parallel economy that where people say, well, I've had enough. I'm gonna go quiet. It's it does, though, and you alluded to this in the Delingpole interview. It does present certain opportunities as well, in that it does imply that perhaps we're going to see a renaissance, emerging from the wreckage. In that, there will be a wholesale rejection of globalism. I do sense that that's beginning to happen already.
Yes.
And in terms of even the rejection of MAGA, because it's clearly, as you indicated, globalism in drag. That's beginning to happen palpably. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel here?
Look, I mean, it's a battle between the generative people in the world and the bureaucrats, the parasitic bureaucrats who swan around in Geneva and Brussels and so on. And what's been happening is that the craziness of these systems of stakeholder capitalism, for example, comes home to roost. And these large corporations are very commonly seen these days financially over-indebted and needing to sell off the crown jewels in order to pay down debt burdens. And that creates an opportunity for people like myself who are in the business of acquiring businesses. So I can acquire a division of a large corporation that's having to sell in order to come up with some liquidity and to service some debt. And that transfers the ownership from the kind of stakeholder capitalist mindset to the entrepreneurial mindset. And that can pay off very quickly. I like to say it's a matter of just not doing the crazy stuff. So the first thing you do is you acquire the business and just stop doing a whole lot of silly stuff. And that produces most of your returns, and anything you get over and above that in terms of better strategic allocations and capital allocations is a cherry on top. So they're very different. Definitely is an opportunity set created by these crazy systems and their implementation, all over the show.
Do you think that'll happen at nation state level, that certain, maybe small nations will realize that there's a significant opportunity here, to nurture, common sense, practical business people and entrepreneurs in order to, leapfrog over the corporatist mindset and agenda and debt-laden mentality as well of many of the corporates?
I can imagine it happening in sort of isolated pockets. But one of the problems that I really grapple with is I don't see that there is any mechanism in place to limit the inexorable growth of the public sector in Western democracies.
Yeah,
There's
I'll just interject there. I did some analysis recently looking at the amount of debt in the UK because the headline debt, it always amazed me that UK debt compared to the United States per capita could be so much lower given the state of the United Kingdom and the growth of the public sector. But I did some analysis on liabilities for public sector pensions. Now, this is just UK pensions payable to public employees. That's all public sectors, pretty much. Now, headline UK debt, public debt, is 2.8 trillion. Whereas the liabilities for public sector pensions, 5.8 trillion.
Yeah.
5.8 trillion just for public sector pensions, you know?
And probably understated,
Yeah, it probably is.
the
Probably is.
injudicious use of overly high discount rates and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's probably an underestimate. And of course, the question has to be asked, well, how on earth are you going to service those benefit liabilities? I don't think it's plausible that they will be serviced. And so some form of what's the word I'm looking for? Some form of retracement with respect to the liabilities, combined with sort of here and there some institutional collapse, reneging on benefits, that kind of thing, or by more insidious fashions. So by making healthcare just unobtainable, so that people die younger and have fewer years in retirement during which to receive benefits, that kind of thing, or some combination of those factors is likely. And there's going to be a lot of disappointed retirees out there, I think, in the West.
Yeah, I think you're right. But in some weird way, maybe it's because I'm a rabid libertarian. In some weird way, I think the idea of a wholesale collapse of the public sector and them not being able to meet their liabilities is redemptive in my view. If that is where we see the social change coming from, an awareness and an increasing awareness on the part of policymakers that there is absolutely no way for them to meet these liabilities, then perhaps we start getting some common sense policy debates going. But of course, they're nowhere close to that at the minute. Certainly not in the United States, certainly not in the United Kingdom. But I think there will come a time when they're going to have to face up to it. I did a presentation recently in Edinburgh in front of a bunch of former academics and teachers and so on. And I posited this idea that perhaps the cleansing is going to come from a total redefinition of the public sector. And now, initially, I think a lot of people in the audience thought that this was quite horrific because it would mean that they would have to take a haircut in terms of pension liabilities and so on. But is that the ultimate way out?
I think it's kind of part of the story. One of the challenges is that when you have this kind of financial indebtedness or systemic gearing in play, the renegotiation of the claims that's required, in effect, what you need is like a bankruptcy process. So, the various classes of claimants need to arrive at a negotiated settlement with one another. But that process itself can become a drain on economies. And you see it very clearly in France. There's this ongoing question of whether they can raise the retirement age. And it's political suicide at the moment. The electorate is simply not up for increasing the retirement age. It's if you want to lose an election, you make it part of your platform that people should retire at 65 instead of 62 or whatever, So I think the renegotiation of these claims is a much more difficult process, and it's very difficult to maintain intergenerational equity in such processes. It's also related to this is the question of what has happened to the Western middle classes. From 1971 to the present day, they've been creeping along at a growth in per capita income of around 0%. So, time has stood still for the middle classes in America and in Western Europe. And that I think is kind of when you don't have a vibrant middle class, then the writing is on the wall. And when that collapsing or eviscerated middle class runs into the intergenerational wealth transfer problem, I think you have a recipe for basically societal collapse. And I wish I could tell a more positive story than that one, but I just do not see the mechanisms out there. They've yet to be invented. The mechanisms by which we would control the size of the public sector, limit the size of government and its role in the economy, the mechanisms by which we would free ourselves of the mutual infiltration of the state and large corporations, on the other hand, which leads to this kind of very toxic lobbying, interventionist prioritization of large company interests over the interests of the citizens of a country. I think this is going to end in tears.
Yeah, no, yeah, I tend to agree with you. Now, if I could just take the discussion in a slightly different direction now, I think we'll return to some of these points related to the sort of structural fault lines within society. But last week, the BBC obviously got itself embroiled in a conflict with the Trump administration regarding its odd editing policy in relation to the Trump speech relating to the January 6th event. However, it does indicate that the BBC, in common with other state broadcasters in the West, is clearly peddling a particular line, and it's come unstuck a little bit. This manifested itself obviously during the pandemic, so-called pandemic period, with an assault on our intelligence, and namely spreading nonsense relating to the pandemic. You recently wrote a tweet where you sort of outlined the state of the world, but you led on the pandemic, and obviously that's where you and I met, because we responded very similarly to the COVID nonsense. But at the heart of this issue, in terms of the BBC's presence in UK society and so on, is the fact that it has been spreading misinformation and nonsense and expecting people to believe it. But it's now, of course, come unstuck in a very, very ironic way. Are we getting to the stage? And the other thing that's happened, of course, is that the Telegraph has been running a story saying that the UK quangos related to healthcare are unwilling to admit the fact that the vaccines were damaging because they don't want to spook people who had them. Are we seeing an unraveling of the misinformation pandemic that took place over the last 5 years or so?
I'm afraid I don't see that. The BBC is just one of many rotten eggs in the landscape of highly concentrated ownership of media. And the BBC is not alone in being a weapon of propaganda directed against the citizenry of the country. This is what mainstream media is. It's a propaganda vehicle for the state to use against its citizens. And so it's one, as I say, it's just one bad egg among many. And so it has the feeling of a little bit farcical, a little bit of a clown show at the moment, with all of a sudden people who have been spitting on British heritage now claiming that the BBC is a very important part of what it means to be British, and we need to step up and save the Beeb from the rapacious Nazi Donald Trump. And so for me, it's just yet another source of mirth and clown world antics. Will there be a result? Yeah, maybe the institution gets hung out to dry. Maybe something falls apart. But I don't think too much turns on it.
Yeah, and it's rather unfortunate, of course, isn't it, that it takes it requires Trump's involvement, to shine a light on the fact that the BBC has been systematically misinforming and misleading and judiciously editing. Because we were regaled with the evening exposition of the parabolic increase in infections during the COVID era. This all being fed by the powers that be, so and yet it takes this type of thing to call them out, which makes you think that maybe it's another psyop.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously the BBC was involved in creating the myth of the novel deadly virus and the idea that there was a pandemic of a respiratory virus that threatened young people and school age children, and that was a risk to everybody. And this whole sort of story, the whole narrative, was a propaganda exercise. There was no pandemic. That is the hard reality here. And I don't care how many people had how much research money going into claim of function research projects or into serial passage experiments or whatnot. They didn't produce a viral bioweapon, and they didn't leak one from a lab. There was no coherent disease, no coherent characterizable disease. The whole testing apparatus was a load of complete nonsense. The whole description of what constituted a case and these rising case numbers and attributions of death, all of that was fraudulent. And the BBC was one of, hundreds or maybe thousands of media outlets who were all sustaining this false narrative 24/7.
Do you think Kennedy is sustaining a false narrative in a different way? Clearly his campaign agenda was to, take on the pharmaceutical companies, the people behind the so-called vaccines. But now it's being diluted somewhat, and he seems to be buddying up with people who want to continue the germ theory narrative vis-a-vis COVID. Is it just taking a slightly different direction, but the misinformation is still right there at the center of it?
Yeah, I regard RFK Jr. as one of the good ones, and we don't have too many of them in the world. I've spent enough time with him to see how he thinks, to understand the kind of position that any political figure who's inserted into one of these bureaucracies faces. The kind of skullduggery, really. You've got a whole bureaucracy there that wants to limit your ability to perform in your position, wants to contain the impact of the change you would bring about. And so it's a world of messy compromise and information flow control. And so I think people kind of get a little bit too trigger happy when they see something that doesn't quite gel with what they think of Kennedy or what he thinks. So they'll take a comment about wearables or something like this and say, oh, you see, he's just trying to bring about the surveillance state in the healthcare domain. But what he's actually talking about is something pretty sensible, which was glucose monitoring, to try and rein in the epidemic of pre-diabeticism. There's a huge problem in terms of how Americans and Western Europeans are eating and what they're putting into their mouths and what this is doing to their bodies. So he may be talking about something fairly pragmatic, and everybody just takes it with the maximal spin of globalist technocratic surveillance kind of angle. I think he's a solid man who's working very hard against some formidable foes who would rather see him dead than in office. And it's a very, very tough position to be in. It takes its toll. It's a hard, hard life. And he seems to be pretty capable at managing these processes and managing the stress that comes with it. And I do admire that because I can't actually think of that many world leaders who I do admire. When you look at the slate of Starmer and Macron and Trudeau and Carney and all of these absolute actors and airheads, there's nobody to admire. Putin, Orban, these people seem to be level-headed and sensible and describing the world in fairly accurate terms. But you will never hear anything sensible coming out of the mouth of a Carney or a Kerry or any of these people.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think we need to give the guy a bit of a break. It is a vast empire as well in the United States, and a lot of people are very dependent on the pharmaceutical sector. So I think clearly he was warned off going in full guns blazing because he could have wrecked a substantial section of the U.S. economy. But of course, it's an economy. The pharmaceutical sector in the United States is built on a false premise, of course. But still, he does have to tread carefully. I can see that.
Yeah, I mean, this whole idea that there's a pill, or an injection as an answer to every health problem is a deeply flawed one, and I think he knows that. But as you correctly point out, there are powerful vested interests at play, and there's a kind of middle path that you have to go along as a holder of political office over one of these deep state behemoths. And so yeah, I think he's for real, and he's a serious player and a sincere person who's doing his best with to play a very bad hand, and managing, as far as I can tell, pretty well.
Do you think he'll get to the stage of saying that there was no pandemic?
I think he already believes that. That all of the stories of risk and danger were objects of propaganda, and that there was no real risk additive pathogen in circulation in 2020 or at any time thereafter. I think that's probably his personal perspective. I am guessing. I can't tell you for sure. But that's not where the sort of the Overton window hasn't gotten to that point yet. For most people, there's this false dichotomy that's presented as, did it come from a pangolin or did it come from a lab? And of course, those aren't the only two alternatives. The third alternative was, what is it? Was there an it? It's amazing how much you can learn from the Pfizer phase 3 trials and the reactogenicity study that accompanied them or lagged them by a few weeks. From those studies, what do you learn? The first thing you learn is that whatever COVID was, it wasn't at all dangerous. There was nobody dying of COVID in these study groups. It was very hard to find people who got sick from COVID. The other thing is there's no characterization of a unique disease. They listed the COVID symptoms, and they were fatigue, headache, sore throat, runny nose, cough, myalgia. These are the standard syndromes or standard symptoms of any number of diseases and disorders out there. So they weren't really describing clinically something that had been characterized as a new disease called COVID. And there was this incredible bias in the testing. They weren't randomized controlled trials with double blinding. They were unblinded. And so what was happening is the propensity to test among the unvaccinated was much higher than the propensity to test amongst the vaccinated, even though COVID symptoms as described were some 10 times more prevalent among the vaccinated group than they were among the unvaccinated group. So you're dealing with a complete scientific fraud. Where they managed to massage the amount of testing they were doing so that they would have more PCR positives in conjunction with symptoms in the unvaccinated group. It's just a fraud. Yeah. So we learn COVID not dangerous, if there even is such a thing called COVID, and the vaccines are definitely not safe and effective. They're on any clinical outcome. The vaccinated population did worse, whether it was hospital admission, severe adverse events, death. On every relevant clinical outcome, the vaccinated population did worse than the unvaccinated population. And the newspaper reports of 95% safe and effective, or 95% effective and safe, were completely just made up. There was no real scientific basis for drawing any of those conclusions.
And still, even the Telegraph reports, are couched in the terms of the fact, that this vaccine was required because we were in some type of emergency scenario, which was palpably untrue. But that's
totally untrue.
And that's the slit of the Overton window that we have to work in. But do you sense so that this idea that we can, Mary Finch, Mary AF has written about this a lot, that you're just simply not permitted still and if you do say that COVID was a fraud, that it was a scam, that the vaccines were not required, that is the scenario in which you will be shut down. You will not be given. And I think people who go there are most likely to be shadow banned still on Twitter. I refuse to call it.
Indeed. This is across the board. So people like me, and there are a number of people who contend that there was no pandemic. It's not like some divergent or extreme viewpoint. A lot of serious researchers have looked at the data. Stefan Homburg, Denny Ranku, Mike Eden. A lot of people have looked at the data and said, show me a pandemic. Where are the cluster and ripple effects in your data that are evidence of there being a contagious event underway? It's simply not there. Where is the force of mortality that accompanies this diagnosis? Because it's simply not there. You've got in most places, 2020 went by with no excess mortality out of the normal range. The excess mortality that there was in a few concentrated locales. So there's no evidence in the epidemiological data. The human challenge trials all failed, and we simply don't see a pandemic. It was all a media narrative.
On the subject of media narrative, again, referring back to that tweet, you put out the 6 tenets: no pandemic, CO2 nonsense, central banking and CBDCs, immigration, wars, and the whole trans debate. All of those were associated with a very similar trajectory in terms of media momentum.
Yes.
The media drawing attention to an issue that we actually hadn't really considered. Like trans is a classic case. Most people have not come across anyone who they may have known somebody some guys who like to dress up in frocks, but they have never really come across anybody who wants to transition to the other sex. The incidence of such people in society is minuscule. But similarly, a lot of people had no knowledge whatsoever of the situation in Ukraine and the fact that Eastern Ukraine was contested territory, or the Minsk protocols. But suddenly a media agenda is projected into universally at the same time. And COVID was a classic example of that. Does that indicate that there is some degree of coordination and control of these major media narratives that are designed to obfuscate and confuse as much as possible?
Yeah, well, there has to be. I mean, when you've got the media ownership as concentrated as it is, there absolutely has to be narrative control going on, and that's why the concentration is in order, so that the elites can control narratives and shape the permitted range of political discourse. These are not contentious things to be saying. I think any analyst of media and propaganda would just nod along with this. This is not contentious. And so, yes, these are all hoaxes, distraction events, designed to divert the public's attention from the underlying inexorable process towards the technocratic surveillance state.
And there also seems to be an element in each one of them about the concentration of assets in a relatively small number of hands. Clearly that's the case in terms of the whole global warming nonsense. But similarly, the creation of devalued fiat currencies, while people accumulate vast amounts of assets that have tangible value. Is that ultimately the end game? I think a few of us in the freedom movement have always been of the view that this is ultimately about money and about asset allocation. Is that why these are the 6, if you like, key agenda areas in terms of media manipulation, psychological operations, and ultimately consolidation of media power?
Yeah, I think there's a great flattening underway. So the elimination of diversity on any number of dimensions. There is this sort of DEI charge where diversity, equity, and inclusivity, where we supposedly are supporting diversity. But what it means is lots of people who look very different but think in exactly the same way.
Yeah.
And it's this sort of flattening of the topography of society and homogenization that is the friend of centralization. This is the aspiration. And so all of those trajectories move in that way, where you basically shut down dissent on any one of those key 6 items. You're not allowed to contest the climate crisis hoax. You're not allowed to contest the absurd idea behind trans, which is that a man can know what it is like to be a woman. There's just a few. I remember just a few years ago that used to be called mansplaining, and it was not allowed. You were not allowed to say that you knew what it was like to be a woman if you were a man. But now we've suddenly accepted not only that people can have that knowledge, which is absurd, but that we should take them seriously when they claim to have it. And so you have these sort of electric fence issues where people who touch that wire know very well that they're going to get a shock, and so they stay away from the wire, and it just flattens the social discourse.
I'll ask you one final question. I want just to refer to an interview that Sonia Poulton did this morning with a guy in the UK called Warren Thornton. And Sonia was interviewing this guy about the the kind of origins of the psyops, if you like. And his view was that clearly it is orchestrated. He would be of a similar view to you. Indicated that it's organizations like Bilderberg that kind of originate, spawn all of this stuff, and then it's permeated through various other entities such as the World Economic Forum, etc. But what's your view, or who do you believe pull all of the triggers really in terms of these agenda items?
I think Ian Davis's analysis is probably accurate, that the power sits at the level of the control structure above the Bank of International Settlements. I think that's where the dark masters are in power, and we don't know their names, or we know some of their names maybe, but I think it's at that level that the whole architecture is controlled. Anything inside the United Nations is downstream of that via the IMF and the World Bank. That sits inside the UN, but is very much under the sway of the Bank of International Settlements. The entire Basel Accord basis for rolling out the capital requirements is driving in the direction of almost like a social credit score, where your capital requirements are determined by whether a company is compliant with ESG or with net zero or some such nonsense. That's the direction of travel. So I think it is at the Bank of International Settlements that all eyes should rest.
Okay, Nick, that's fabulous. Thank you so much indeed. In terms of people getting further information about what you're up to and so on, where's the best place to go? And what are your particular focuses at the minute in terms of business and investment and so on?
I'm available on X at Nick Hudson CT is my handle, and I'm also on Substack with the same handle. Business-wise, my focus is on, as I say, buying divisions out of large corporations. I think it's like shooting fish in a barrel at the moment, and that's what our investment firm is targeting, transactions of that nature, and it's working out well for us so far. So we're just going to keep on doing more of the same. And then I get very active at the level of local community and political engagement at a municipal level and a local government level. I see that as the way forward. We need to set up parallel structures and start taking it to the powers that be in a fragmented, decentralized kind of way.